Hello and welcome. My name is David Trigo, Program Director of the Washington Urban Debate League. I'll be your narrator as we go through the following video series about our debate topics this year, some tricks and techniques to make you a better debater, and more. This video will focus on this year's debate topic, education. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. Our core files can be found at the website on your screen, as well as additional research assistance. If you'd like me to review any of your cases, just shoot them over via email. This year, debate will center around a resolution. Resolved. The United States federal government should substantially increase its funding and/or regulation of elementary and/or secondary education in the United States. First, we'll talk a little bit about education in the United States. Next, we'll talk through how to read that long and complicated resolution. Lastly, we'll go over some of the ground or possible arguments that the affirmative and the negative could make this year. First, let's talk a little bit about the United States and education policy. Schooling starts early, often in pre-K. In this debate, however, we'll be focusing on elementary education, which starts in kindergarten and runs through middle school. This is where students focus on learning basic skills like reading, writing, and counting. Developing a strong foundation here is what all other schooling is based on. Secondary education, or high school as we now call it, dates back to 1830. In 1892, the National Education Association, or the NEA, was established, which has become the country's largest teachers' union. Teachers' unions are always at the forefront of most policy decisions when it comes to education. Back then, the initial debate was, should we train students for a trade to learn skills to go directly into the workforce, or should we encourage more schooling to give them a more well-rounded education? Race and education in this country have always been linked together. Early on, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson, creating a separate but equal doctrine regarding education. Students could be segregated by race as long as the facilities and other opportunities available for them were, quote, equal. This segregation resulted in generations of underserved African Americans and other minorities in this country. However, in 1954, the Supreme Court overruled Plessy v. Ferguson in the case now known as Brown v. the Board of Education. It ruled that separate but equal doctrine was not actually equal and forced the end of segregation. As a result, President Lyndon Johnson passed the ESEA, or the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. One of its main tenets was what we call Title I funding, federal dollars allocated to underserved schools in an attempt to even the odds. The No Child Left Behind Act was President Bush's signature education proposal in 2001. His goal was to require standardized tests in exchange for states and districts receiving federal funds. Schools and students needed to demonstrate adequate yearly progress. The question is, how do you measure progress? And do high-stakes tests encourage rampant cheating? President Obama implemented what he called the Race to the Top, a competitive grant program awarding funds for complying with the Common Core standards, implementing accountability reforms, and turning around low-performing schools. States desperate for the education funding competed to reform their policies to become eligible for Race to the Top dollars. The newest large-scale piece of legislation regarding education is the ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. This includes high standards for what is considered proficient and continues to authorize annual standardized testing. It encourages evidence-based interventions in failing schools and increases investment in pre-K education. It also devolves a lot of authority back to the states for how they will reach these goals, requiring only that they present a plan to be approved by the Federal Department of Education. There are many different types of schools in this country, and who runs them often impacts the type of services and support that students that attend them receive. The term public school is a large umbrella that encompasses traditional neighborhood schools, charter schools, magnet schools, vocational schools, and alternative education programs. Private schools and homeschooling networks also exist, as well as attempts to expand into the virtual world. This chart goes over some of the major differences between public schools, private schools, and homeschooling. Some of the major differences include the number of students enrolled, 49 million for traditional public schools compared to 6 million in private and about 1.5 million in homeschooling. The financial requirements to attend. Public schools are paid for through taxpayer dollars, while private schools, the families have to pay tuition to attend. And whether religion can be involved in schooling. In public schools, we have a separation of church and state, meaning that religion cannot be prominently featured in public schools, while many private and homeschooling institutions are based on religious organizations. This chart goes over the administration of education in the United States. As you can see, the federal government provides about 10% of the budget and guides a lot of the broad policy decisions in education. State and local governments provide 60% of the budget and deal with middle management questions such as textbook purchasing and which years you have to go to school. Local school districts provide 30% of the budget and focus on granular things such as teaching strategies and how to assess success. To give some local context, there are 239 schools in the District of Columbia. 111 of them fall under the purview of DC Public Schools, 101 are charter schools, and 27 are privately run. In Prince George's County, there are 332 schools. 208 fall under Prince George's County Public Schools. There are 10 run by charter networks, and 114 of them are run by private institutions. Next, we'll go over some of the key controversies that will be the focus of many of your debates this season. The first is school choice. Schools are largely funded on a per-student basis. If you enroll in a public school, the school gets more money that they are to spend on your education. School choice is built around the idea of giving parents and students options. Most school choice programs take the money allocated per student and provide it to another group to provide education. Charter schools were originally created so that teachers could test new teaching methods and then return to traditional public schools. Charter schools are run by private organizations that receive public funding to run the school. They have to meet the same standards as traditional public schools, but have more freedom to experiment with how they choose to help students meet those standards. School vouchers are another form of school choice, where the government gives the money that would have been spent on a student's education to that family. The family can now use this voucher to shop around the market of potential schools to choose the best option for their child. This post-tax coupon is currently available in some form in more than 30 states and the District of Columbia. The McKay Scholarship Program in Florida, for example, provides vouchers to students with disabilities so they can choose the school that best fits their educational needs. In the District of Columbia, the Opportunity Scholarship Program offers a select number of students to attend private schools free of charge. Supporters of school vouchers say that you don't have to pay for bad schooling with a voucher because it lets you move if you feel like your school is letting you down. Critics make several arguments. First, that it takes funding away from public schools. Second, it helps people who would have paid for private school anyway. And third, because vouchers are often not enough to cover the full cost of tuition, that it's a crutch for the middle class rather than the poor who it claims to help. Common Core attempts to standardize education across state and district lines in the United States, with all high school graduates having the same skills. It outlines quantifiable benchmarks in English and math and other core subjects for every student in every grade from pre-K through high school. In many areas, it raises the bar above previous state standards. Common Core was adopted by 43 states, but is opposed by many conservatives as federal overreach. While Common Core standards have often been renamed and slightly tweaked, they are mostly still in effect today. The achievement gap is a critical component of the educational landscape. Studies show that students of color and students from poor families generally perform worse on most tests of educational achievement than their white or affluent peers. Different methods have been considered and attempted to address the achievement gap, while others suggest that we should simply improve education for all. Standardized testing allows districts, states, and the federal government to have data to see how students are learning and what schools and teachers are effectively doing their jobs and which ones aren't. Tests, however, are an imperfect method of measuring success, and sometimes lead to teachers focusing on passing the test instead of teaching real-world portable skills. Finding the balance of accountability and intellectual freedom is a controversial issue in education today. Ensuring that an effective teacher works with students is a largely bipartisan goal. But what makes a good teacher? Well, no one can seem to agree. Some point to experience in the classroom, while others point to test scores or the academic background of the teacher. This issue largely comes to a head when it comes to paying teachers. Some people prefer performance pay, giving bonuses to teachers whose students perform better, usually measured by standardized tests. Others encourage pay scales based on observation, where educational leads, such as principals, observe teachers at their work, while yet others advocate a blended approach. Education is a hotbed of judicial activity. While the courts often rule on civil rights cases related to education, a myriad of other options could come up in your debates this season. Let's go over a few of them. On the Supreme Court docket right now is Friedrichs versus the California Teachers Association. This case will govern the collective bargaining rights for teachers and could largely reshape the power of unions as we know them. Fisher versus Texas, decided in the last few years, resolved questions of affirmative action for access to higher education. Milliken v. Bradley and San Antonio versus Rodriguez resolve the question of a federal right to education. If either of these cases was overturned, students would have a federal right to education, which would then be protected under the Equal Protection Clause. This means that inequalities in funding, access, and opportunity would be illegal by law. If I had to guess what the next judicial controversy was going to be, I would think it would come in the area of free speech and student rights, given the uproar on college campuses about free speech these days. In this section, we'll talk about how to read the different key words in the resolution. The United States federal government refers to the three branches of government you learned about in civics class: the President and executive agencies, the Congress, and the courts. Which branches will be important this year? Frankly, all of them. With an unpopular Secretary of Education, a Congress that will need to appropriate funds, and a court system that often rules on educational issues, you should brush up on your basic civics. Substantially is included in every resolution, but what it means is largely up for debate. It could be calculated by a percentage or a finite number, or it could be based on the context. Regardless of how you measure it, substantially is included to make sure that the affirmative is large enough and relevant enough in the policy landscape to give the negative something to say against it. Increase suggests that the affirmative has to take proactive action. But what does that mean? Can you increase to decrease? Can you write a regulation to get rid of another one? What about a net increase? Could you add 3 regulations that get rid of 2 others? Can you increase from 0? Does a creation of a new agency or program count as an increase? That's up for you to decide. Federal funding largely runs from the Department of Education. These include things such as Title I funding for underserved schools, IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, provides grants for special education. The United States Department of Agriculture governs funding for school lunches, and HHS supports pre-K and other health programs for students in poor neighborhoods. Disparities in funding between states, within states, and between districts will be a big focus of this year's topic. Let me give you some data. In the District of Columbia, the average public school spends about $15,700 per student. Charters spend a little more, at $18,150 per student. E.L. Haynes is the highest spender, at $25,050 per student. In Prince George's County, there is a much greater range. Students at Barack Obama Elementary only get $7,700 spent on their education, while students at Judith Hoyer Montessori receive more than $24,000 per student spent on their education. Providing some further context, the average public school in Montgomery spends $12,650 on their students. In addition to funding increases, the affirmative team can also increase regulations. Let's go over a few of the existing regulations on education today. The IDEA governs education for students with disabilities. FERPA governs the rights and privacy of students and their families when it comes to personal data. Title I regulates how low-income schools support students. Title II governs teacher prep. Title VI talks about accountability. Title VII governs education on Native American reservations. And Title IX governs equality in education, especially related to gender issues. Now that we know that we have to increase funding or regulation for education, we have to ask, what is education? Does it mean changes to the types of schools, such as advocating for more charter schools? Does it mean changes to the curriculum, such as focusing on science and technology? Does it mean changes to give certain student populations a leg up, such as attempts to narrow the achievement gap? Does it include tangential things like school lunches, building new schools, adding technology in the classroom, or changes to the way teachers are paid or trained? That's for you to decide. The phrase, "in the United States," may seem like an unnecessary addition, but is it? It certainly refers to the 50 states and Washington, D.C., but does it refer to Indian reservations? Maybe. Military bases? Probably. U.S. territories? Again, probably. Can it include the attempts to model the U.S. education system abroad? And how does it engage with virtual schools, which are not tied down to national boundaries? The fundamental question posed by the affirmative this year is, how do we improve education in the United States? Could it be a reduction of exclusion or discriminatory practices? It could be an attempt to reduce the achievement gap. It could be an attempt to improve our economy through science, technology, and ingenuity, and it could be focused on student rights. It could be a meta question of how we teach or learn, or it could be focused on democracy and the purpose of education as citizens. This slide goes over the wide range of potential affirmatives on this year's topic. On the left are the WUDL core files available to you on our website, while on the right lists some other potential cases you might hear or you might want to write yourself, ranging from transgender rights and discipline reform to policies addressing teacher shortages and school lunches, to curriculum interventions, such as engaging with the Common Core or teaching more climate science or civics in our classrooms. It could be a reduction in high-stakes testing, an increase in school choice, or changes in the way we secure our schools. On the negative, there are lots of reasons why education reform hasn't happened already. They often are very costly, they are hard and complicated to implement or even design. There are questions of federalism. Who is the most appropriate actor to carry out the reform? Is it the federal government, the states, or the districts? And what happens if we have the wrong actor increase their role in education? Many education reforms are unpopular and have political consequences. And sometimes education is just not that important to produce the change wanted. This slide should give you an idea of some concrete examples of negative arguments. On the left are the WUDL core files available for you on our website, while on the right are a list of other potential negative arguments you might hear or might want to write yourself, ranging from disadvantages about the economy and student data and religious freedom, counterplans about different agencies, executive orders, or private organizations, or critiques discussing questions of race, gender, and identity, different instructional methods, or teaching methods. You could also get into critiques of capitalism and other structures that impact how we engage our education system.